Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were a working-class American couple and committed communists who spied for the Soviet Union. In 1949, as tensions between the US and USSR peaked, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, triggering an investigation that eventually led to the Rosenbergs. David Greenglass, an army machinist at Los Alamos and Ethel's brother, confessed to passing nuclear secrets to the Soviets and identified Julius as the key organizer of a spy network linked to the Soviet NKVD. They were convicted in 1951 for conspiracy to commit espionage and treason. On June 18, 1953, they were reunited in adjoining death cells at Sing Sing prison. They refused a final meal and spent their last hours speaking through a glass partition. With no final words, Julius was executed first at 8 p.m. on June 19th, dying instantly from the first electric shock. Ethel followed shortly after, but her execution was botched. 3 shocks failed to end it, and 2 more were needed before she was pronounced dead at 8:11 p.m. after nearly 5 minutes. Witnesses reported smoke rising from her head. The Rosenbergs remained the only American civilians executed for espionage in the Cold War. Guy Fawkes was part of a group of English Catholics who planned to kill King James I and the Protestant leadership by blowing up the Palace of Westminster in London. Their goal was to restore a Catholic monarch. The plot collapsed when authorities received an anonymous warning letter and searched the cellars beneath the House of Lords. There, they found Fawkes guarding barrels of gunpowder on the night of November 5, 1605. Arrested with matches in his pockets, Fawkes had no regret except that the plan had failed. Suspended by manacles and stretched on the rack, he eventually confessed and gave up his partners. Fawkes was found guilty of high treason, a crime punished by being drawn backwards to his death by a horse, having the wiener cut off and burned, and being decapitated and dismembered in case he was still alive. On January 31st, 1606, Fawkes was dragged from the tower to Old Palace Yard, the very building he tried to destroy. Fawkes was the last to mount the scaffold, asking forgiveness from the king, but it was too late. As he climbed the ladder, he jumped and broke his neck. His body was still quartered, and the pieces were sent across the kingdom as a warning to future traitors. Robert Ford became infamous as the dirty little coward who betrayed and killed his friend, the outlaw Jesse James. On April 3, 1882, Ford and his brother Charlie met Jesse at his home in Missouri to plan a bank robbery. When Jesse turned to straighten a crooked picture on the wall, Bob drew his gun and shot him in the back of the head to claim his bounty. Ford ran into the street shouting that he had killed Jesse James, but instead of praise, he was condemned as a traitor who had murdered a folk hero. The Ford brothers were quickly charged with murder and sentenced to hang, but Missouri's governor pardoned them. The promised reward was far less than expected, and back home, they were despised for betraying James. Robert became an unwanted celebrity. He drifted from town to town, opening saloons and trying to outrun his reputation. In Las Vegas, he was run out after losing a shooting contest, and he eventually set up a tent saloon in Colorado. On June 8, 1892, Sheriff Ed O'Kelly walked into his saloon with a shotgun, greeted him with, "Hello, Bob," and, as Ford looked him into the eyes, fired both barrels into his chest, blowing a hole into him. Ford was 30 years old. Kelly never explained his motive and was sentenced to life in prison. Judas Iscariot was one of Jesus' 12 apostles and is remembered for betraying him to the Sanhedrin, who wanted Jesus dead because they saw him as a threat to their authority. Judas accepted 30 pieces of silver to lead them to Jesus, resulting in his arrest. When Judas realized this would lead to Jesus' crucifixion, he tried to return the money to the chief priests, but they refused, calling it blood money. Judas threw the coins at them and left. One account says he then hanged himself. Another account in the book of Acts says Judas used the money to buy a field and died there after falling headlong and bursting open with his bowels spilled on the ground. Vidkun Quisling was a Norwegian politician who chose to side with Nazi Germany during World War II. When Hitler invaded Norway in 1940, Quisling went on national radio and declared himself the country's new leader, claiming to act in cooperation with the Germans despite having no authority from the Norwegian government. After Germany's surrender in 1945, Quisling believed he could still negotiate with the Norwegian resistance, but he was soon forced to turn himself in. In his trial, he insisted he wanted Norwegian independence and refused to admit wrongdoing. Psychiatrists evaluated him but found him sane. Quisling was convicted of treason and sentenced to death. On October 24, 1945, he was woken at 2 a.m. He was then led to a clearing in Akechi's fortress, where a firing squad composed of Norwegian military policemen was waiting, with only a few witnesses present, including a priest. His last words were, "I'm convicted unfairly, and I die innocent." The order to fire was given, and Quisling died instantly, riddled with bullets. His body was dissected by a professor to examine his brain. His betrayal was so despised that his name became a permanent insult. Today, calling someone a Quisling means that they are a traitor, willing to sell out their own country. Ephialtes of Trachis became one of the most reviled figures of the Greco-Persian Wars. In 480 BC, as Xerxes I invaded Greece, King Leonidas and 300 Spartans held the narrow pass at Thermopylae, where the Persian army couldn't use its vast numbers. The Greeks held the position for 2 days, cutting down thousands and blocking the advance. Ephialtes betrayed his own people by revealing a hidden mountain path that allowed the Persians to outflank the defenders. His guidance led directly to the fall of the Greek position and defeat. He expected a reward from Xerxes, but none came. Instead, the Greek allies later placed a bounty on his head, forcing him into a life of fear and hiding. About 10 years later, Ephialtes was taken out by Akechi of Trachis, an assassin paid by the Spartans to avenge his act of treason. How it was done is unclear. Mir Jafar was a Bengal army commander whose opportunism made him one of the most infamous traitors in South Asian history. In 1757, the Brits promised him the throne of Bengal in exchange for betraying his ruler at the Battle of Plassey. Jafar agreed, held back his troops in the middle of the battle, and ensured a British victory. Siraj-ud-Dawla was captured and executed, and Mir Jafar was installed as a British-controlled puppet ruler, marking the beginning of British political domination in India. Once in power, he discovered that the British demands were endless and left him powerless. So he flip-flopped to the Dutch and supported their attempt to challenge the British, but the Dutch were crushed at the Battle of Chinsura. So Jafar went back to being the loyal doormat to the Brits. In his final years, his health nosedived. He became addicted to opium and suffered from leprosy, eventually going blind and losing his fingers. Mir Jafar died on February 5th, 1765, a husk of his former self whose name became synonymous with treachery. Alcibiades was a powerful Athenian statesman and general during the Peloponnesian War, when Athens and Sparta fought for the hegemony in ancient Greece. Driven by self-interest and arrogance, he changed his allegiance constantly. At first, he served Athens, but when charged with sacrilege, he defected to Sparta, where he advised the Spartans on military strategy against his home city. But after making enemies in Sparta as well, he sought refuge in Persia, advising them in the ongoing conflict. His opportunistic nature led him back to Athens, where he briefly regained power as a general, only to be exiled again by his political enemies. In the end, he took refuge in the Persian court. In 404 BC, while living in Phrygia with his mistress Timandra, Alcibiades' residence was set on fire, likely by the Spartans. He attempted to escape, rushing out dagger in hand, but was pierced by a shower of arrows. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, is infamous for his shifting loyalties in the Wars of Roses, a civil war fought for control of the English throne. Initially aligned with his brother Edward IV, Clarence's ambitions for power led him to repeatedly change sides. George backed the rival Lancastrians, and even played a role in the Yorkists' defeat at the Battle of Edgecote Moor, leading to his brother's temporary imprisonment. Despite his betrayal, George later returned to Edward's side at the Battle of Barnet. Eventually, George's relationship with his brother worsened, especially after Edward blocked his marriage to Mary of Burgundy. His downfall came when one of his servants was tortured into confessing a plot to take out Edward. Clarence was arrested, tried for treason, and found guilty. He was executed on February 18, 1478, at the Tower of London by drowning in a barrel of wine. Marcus Junius Brutus was one of the central figures behind the assassination of Julius Caesar. During a Senate meeting, Brutus and other conspirators surrounded Caesar and stabbed him 23 times. Brutus had been close to Caesar and personally pardoned by him after he fought against Caesar in the civil war on Pompey's side. After Caesar's death, the conspirators tried to rally public support, but the crowd reacted with anger. Brutus and the others then met Marcus Antonius, a strong supporter of Caesar, and accepted his terms: a public reading of Caesar's will and a full state funeral. This was a bad decision. At the funeral, Antonius showed Caesar's bloody robes and read his generous will, stirring the crowd into a fury that forced Brutus and the others to flee east. Caesar's supporters then formed a second triumvirate and launched a vengeance campaign that became the Liberators' Civil War. Brutus and co-conspirator Cassius set up their base in Greece. The opposing forces met near Philippi in 42 BC. The battle ended without a clear victor, but the second encounter on October 23rd was decisive. Brutus's forces were crushed by Antonius and Octavian. Brutus escaped into the hills with some troops, but realizing the war was lost and capture inevitable, he impaled himself by falling on his own sword. Benedict Arnold was an American who fought bravely for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War and earned the rank of Major General. Once trusted deeply by George Washington, Arnold's reputation as a hero turned to infamy when he betrayed the revolution he helped lead. In 1780, while commanding the fort at West Point, he plotted to surrender it to the British. The plan was uncovered in September of that year, forcing him to flee to British lines. Arnold then led British troops against his American brothers he had once fought beside. After the war, he moved to England, where he was constantly broke. But then in 1801, his health sharply declined. He suffered from gout and dropsy, which left him in constant pain and dependent on a cane. In June the same year, after days of fever and delirium, Benedict Arnold died in London at the age of 60, leaving behind debt. On his deathbed he said, "Let me die in my old uniform in which I fought my battles. May God forgive me for ever having put on another." Almost no one attended his funeral. Mata Hari, born Margaretha Zelle, was a Dutch exotic dancer and courtesan who became one of the most famous alleged spies of World War I. Her Dutch neutrality allowed her to travel freely, and she became involved with French intelligence. French officers approached her to spy on the Germans in exchange for permission to visit a pilot on the front she fell in love with. Before the war, she had performed for Crown Prince Wilhelm, eldest son of Kaiser Wilhelm II. The French intelligence service, the Deuxième Bureau, believed she could seduce the Crown Prince and obtain military secrets. So she was offered a lot of cash. In 1916, Mata Hari attempted to meet the Crown Prince and also engaged with several German military leaders, claiming she would share French secrets with them for payment. Some believe she acted as a double agent there, exploiting both sides. In January 1917, German radio messages described the activities of a spy codenamed H21, whose description matched hers. The French intercepted these messages and identified H21 as Mata Hari. Evidence suggests these messages may have been deliberately created to provoke her arrest. She was arrested in Paris on February 13, 1917, and then tried for espionage. Despite accusations that her actions led to the deaths of 50,000 soldiers, no concrete evidence supported this claim. On October 15, 1917, she was led outside the Cheron barracks in front of 12 soldiers, refused a blindfold, and blew a kiss to the executioners before being riddled with bullets. And to ensure her death, an officer fired another single shot into her head. She was 41. Mata Hari's conviction is considered controversial, with claims that the French army used her as a scapegoat and that evidence against her was falsified. Her body was unclaimed and used for medical study. Her head was embalmed and displayed in a Paris museum, but it later disappeared and remains missing. Akechi Mitsuhide was a trusted samurai general under Lord Oda Nobunaga, who was about to unify Japan. While Nobunaga prepared for another fight and stayed at his temple in Kyoto with only a small non-military entourage, Mitsuhide, probably driven by a hunger for power, plotted a coup. With Nobunaga's guards scattered across the country, security was minimal. Before dawn, on June 21st, 1582, Mitsuhide marched his troops into Kyoto and surrounded the temple. Nobunaga was caught off guard and outnumbered. After a brief fight, he retreated inside, set the room on fire, and committed seppuku. Mitsuhide then tried to secure power, but few trusted him, especially since he didn't have Nobunaga's head. Once Hideyoshi, a loyal supporter of Oda, heard of his death, he immediately marched his army back to Kyoto. Mitsuhide only had a small army, while Hideyoshi gathered former Oda loyalists and raised a huge force. On July 2nd, 1582, they met at the Battle of Yamazaki. Mitsuhide's troops got smashed, and the coward fled. Later that day, he was ambushed by bandits and sliced to pieces. Wang Jingwei is one of the most infamous politicians in Chinese history. Once a respected revolutionary who had fought for China's independence, he sided with Imperial Japan after they invaded his homeland in the 1930s during World War II. Wang wanted peace with the invaders, arguing that China should collaborate rather than resist. This stance led him to defect in 1940, when he established a puppet government in Nanjing under complete Japanese control. His government served Japanese interests, suppressing Chinese resistance movements and assisting Japan in exploiting China's resources. In 1944, Wang went to Japan for medical treatment after suffering from an unresolved wound from an earlier assassination attempt. His health, already declining due to chronic illnesses such as pneumonia, worsened. He died on November 10th, 1944 in Nagoya Hospital, reportedly from myeloma, a type of cancer. His body was returned to Nanjing, China, where he was buried in a state funeral organized by the Japanese. Soon after Japan's defeat, the Kuomintang government under Chiang Kai-shek blew up Wang's tomb and burned his corpse. Robert Hanssen was an FBI agent who spied for the Soviets and later Russia for over 20 years. He leaked around 6,000 highly classified documents on nuclear strategies, military programs, and counterintelligence operations. His espionage inflicted massive damage on US national security. On February 18, 2001, he was caught at Foxstone Park in Virginia, leaving a package at a dead drop. To avoid execution, he pleaded guilty to 15 accounts of espionage and was sentenced to 15 life terms without parole at ADX Florence. Hanssen died in his cell on June 5, 2023 from colon cancer.